All at once, Louise broke into a rapid-fire attack of barking. I wanted to check out Max's reaction, but Harrison's voice startled the thought right out of me. "What's going on in here?" he asked, suddenly entering through the gate. Everyone froze. "What's all this noise? Now calm down, or back to your bungalows you go." Jill appeared next to him carrying a large bag of garbage. She was panting slightly. "What is it?" she asked. "Oh, nothing. Just a dogfight, I guess," Harrison said. Dogfight, I thought. What a quaint expression. I wondered if people ever had dogfights. As Harrison and Jill turned to go, Jill tripped on the very rock I'd seen her trip over several times before. The bag of garbage flew out of her hand, spilling its contents all over the ground. Harrison jumped back as some of the debris landed on his shoe. "What a clumsy oaf!" he shouted. "Can't you do anything right?" Jill's face turned red. I could see tears come into her eyes as she spoke. "Well, aren't you Mr. Perfect all of a sudden?" she asked, her voice quivering. "If you weren't pushing me so hard, I wouldn't be like this in the first place." "Well, maybe if you weren't like this in the first place," Harrison retorted, "you wouldn't think I was pushing you so hard." Jill's mouth fell open. After a moment she spoke. "And maybe you'd like to work by yourself the rest of the day." Okay, Harrison replied in a softer voice. "I'm sorry. Come on, let's forget it and clean this up." Jill, sniffling back her tears, knelt in silence and began shoveling tin cans and bottles back into the plastic bag. "I'm sorry too," she said quietly. "I'm just tired. It's not your fault." They finished their task in total silence. We all sat motionless, watching them. I guess people do have dog fights, I thought. Just before they went out the gate, Harrison turned back to us and said, "Now, keep it down in here." And once again we were left to ourselves. I turned to Max, but saw that he and Georgette had wandered off, and their heads were very close together. Taxi was watching them too, and seemed to be annoyed. When he noticed me looking at him, he said, "A fine thing," and walked away in a huff. Suddenly I found myself alone. I could feel that a light rain was beginning to fall, and a second crack of thunder announced that the storm was about to break again. Not knowing what else to do, I headed back to my bungalow in hopes that Chester might be around to talk to. I guess I was so lost in thought that I never saw them, but when I was almost to my bungalow, I tripped. Looking down, I discovered what had crossed my path were two long, low dogs, the likes of which I'd never seen before. As politely as I knew how, I spoke. "Please forgive me for tripping over you," I said. Not at all," said one. "Indeed, it was our fault for—" Yes, said the other, "for walking in your way." "We weren't watching," said the first. "Where we were going," concluded the second. There was a moment's silence as I looked them over. They were almost identical, and though one had a slightly higher-pitched voice than the other, they spoke as if one mind were encased into two bodies. Their heads did not stop bobbing up and down. "I'm Harold," I said. "Howard," said the one with the lower-pitched voice. He nodded his head once. "And Heather," said the other, and she nodded her head crisply. "We're out for a stroll," Howard continued, as if he owed me an explanation. "We do like a stroll, of course. Heather here isn't up to—" Now, Heather said, cutting Howard off. "No need to go into all that, is there?" She smiled vaguely in my direction, and her conversation drew to a halt. The rain began to come down more heavily then. I was more than a little relieved to have a reason to excuse myself. "Well, it was—" I began. Yes, it was," Howard said eagerly. "So sorry we have to run, but—" "Oh, I understand," I said. "But I'm not feeling myself suddenly," Heather added. "Dear, mightn't we—" Yes, of course," Howard said to her. There was a look of great concern in his eyes. "Goodbye, Harold," he said as they turned to leave. "We will talk again, I am sure. Oh, and Harold—" "Yes?" I asked. "Beastly sorry about that noise last night. Frightful, what? But we just can't seem to help it, really." Heather finished the sentence for him. "Come, dear." "Quite," was all that Howard said then, and the two of them strolled off, rather more hurriedly, their heads bobbing like pigeons all the way home. "Chester!" I cried as soon as I saw my friend waiting for me in my bungalow. The rain was really coming down by that time. Chester sat licking a paw and staring into the distance. As he did not respond immediately to my calling, I concluded that he was once again in a state of advanced mellowhood. I waited another moment before I spoke again. "Guess what?" I asked. Chester looked at me through half-lowered lids. "Harold, you know I hate it when you do that," he said. "When I do what?" "When you say, 'Guess what?'" he replied with faint disdain. "How am I supposed to guess what when I don't even know where you're coming from?" "Oh, sorry," I answered. There was a pause. "Harold," he said quietly after a moment. "What?" "I think we've established that I'm not going to guess what. So, why don't you tell me what's on your mind, I have a lot to think about, however, and I don't wish to be distracted by trivia." Oh, I don't think this is trivia, I said, even though I couldn't be sure since I didn't know what trivia was. It has to do with these two strange dogs I just met named Howard and Heather. They said they were sorry about the noise last night. Do you think they were the ones who... Is that all? Chester said sharply, interrupting me. I figured that out long ago. You figured out what? I asked. I hadn't figured anything out except that it was Howard and Heather who had been howling all night. That Howard and Heather are werewolves. I couldn't help myself. I chuckled at the thought of those two little dogs being werewolves. To me, they looked more like sausages with legs, and I told Chester so. Dachshunds, he replied. Gesundheit. I didn't sneeze, Harold. Oh, but you said dachshunds. Gesundheit. Harold, put the etiquette on the shelf for a minute and listen to me. Howard and Heather are not sausages, they are a kind of dog named dachshunds. Because of their long hair, I am assuming that they are what is known as wire-haired dachshunds. But you said they were werewolves. It is my belief, Chester went on, and here he drew out his words to give the impression that what he was saying was of the most crucial importance, that Howard and Heather are a cross between a wire-haired dachshund and a werewolf. He paused and looked at me to check out the impact of what he was saying. There was none. With a slight tremor in his voice, he added, a most vile and dangerous combination. I yawned. I knew Chester well enough to know when to respond and when to yawn, and this was definitely a time to yawn. Oh, you don't believe me, do you? Chester asked. Well, it doesn't matter, Harold. This isn't the first time you've chosen to ignore my warnings, and I'm sure it won't be the last. Just let it be said that Howard and Heather are to be watched. If you ask me, I replied, I believe Lyle is the one to watch. Now there is a basket case. Chester agreed that Lyle was worthy of observation, for he too had witnessed the scene earlier with Louise. Indeed, he concluded, I'd say all the guests in this establishment deserve our careful attention. There is an undercurrent of tension here, Harold. He looked out at the pouring rain and the darkening sky. An undercurrent that will one day erupt with a sudden and terrible force. There was a loud explosion of thunder. I jumped. The storm gathers, Chester commented dryly as I landed. What shall we do? I asked. Nothing to do but wait. He lay down and closed his eyes. Meanwhile, I'm going to get some sleep, while I still can. Mind if I join you? I asked, not wanting to be alone. Not at all, Chester said, making room for me next to him on the rug. I was thinking of how hospitable he was being when I realized that we were in my bungalow. Just one favor, Harold. What's that, Chester? When you dream? Yes? Try not to smack your lips all the time, will you? It drives me crazy. So promising, I fell into a deep sleep. The next thing I remember was the deafening crash of thunder that awakened us. Chester jumped up and ran to the door. It's dark, he cried. Max and Taxi were in the center of the compound, barking loudly. What's going on? I called out. They're late with dinner, Max responded. He and Taxi began barking again as Georgette ran out and joined them. I noticed how she cuddled up to Max's side, and immediately my heart ached for Louise. But since my attention went rather quickly to my stomach, however, my heart didn't ache for very long. What do you think has happened? I asked Chester. I can't go without food. Dogs aren't meant to be starved. Cats are different. Cats can live off their own fat, but dogs are... Try living off the fat on your brain, Chester said, cutting me off. Just then the door to the office swung open, and Jill and Harrison rushed out. Jill was wearing an orange slicker, and Harrison carried an umbrella that quickly turned itself inside out, doing neither him nor our dinners any good. I made a mental note to complain about the service, but later. At the moment, all I cared about was that our food was here at last. The storm was in full force, the wind lashing the rain against us. Harrison and Jill scurried about quickly, calling to each other across the compound. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I did pick up snatches of conversation. Can't understand how we let this happen, Harrison was saying. We've never been late before. It's your fault, you know. I told you to keep your eye on the clock. My fault, Jill answered. You were the one who insisted that we clean the office after we finished the shed. Push, push, push. Okay, Jill, Harrison said with an exasperated tone in his voice. Give it a rest, huh? Give it a rest, he says, Jill muttered to herself. He doesn't even know the meaning of the word. Then turning her attention to us, she said, Oh, you poor things, you must be starving. Sorry, sorry, she kept saying to everyone. Sorry, as she put down the food dishes and scurried us back into our bungalows. I was so relieved to get my dinner, I hardly noticed that I'd gotten soaked by the storm. I was glad, though, when Jill suddenly showed up at the door of my bungalow with a big white towel in her hands. Sorry to have to interrupt you, Harold, she said sweetly, but let me dry you off a little so you can enjoy the rest of your dinner. Jill's hands felt great as she rubbed me down, and I would have happily rolled over for a complete MTR. That's a massage and tummy rub to you, layman, had I not been so anxious to return to eating dinner. I don't know where my head is these days, she said as she rubbed the hair along my back. I completely forgot about feeding you guys tonight, and then we raced out here so fast I left the towels inside and let the door slam shut behind me. She laughed to herself and shook her head. I guess I need a rest too, she said. Dr. Greenbrier and I have been working so hard these past few weeks I'm ready to drop. And Harrison... But I can't blame him, she said seriously. That's no excuse. It would be awful if something happened just because I let myself get a little tired and careless. Jill, Harrison called. I finished drying the rest of them. I'm going back in. Okay, Jill shouted back above the din of the rain. I'll be right there. She turned to me and scratched me behind the ears. Okay, Harold, that's it. Enjoy your dinner now, and get a good night's sleep. Night-night. And she was gone. I liked Jill, I thought, as I plunged back into my food. She was clumsy and forgetful, it was true, but she seemed nice enough. As for Harrison, well, I wasn't sure what to make of him. There was something about him that made me nervous. Besides, anybody who preferred reading comic books to chewing on them was a little suspect in my eyes. Later that night I tried to sleep, but the raging storm and the determined howling of Howard and Heather kept startling me awake. And then I started thinking about what Chester had said earlier. What were his exact words? Something about an undercurrent of tension that would one day erupt with a terrible force. What could he mean? I wondered. Little did I imagine then, tossing and turning in my sleep, that the terrible eruption Chester had predicted had already occurred.